She said it with fire in her eyes and grease on her apron. "I ain't my mother, but I can cook just as good." He didn't flinch, just handed her a sack of beans and one chance. Neither of them knew that one simple supper was about to become something like salvation, or something like war. The doors of the Lone Trail Saloon swung open, not with a bang, but with a tired, weary creak that said it had seen too much. Every eye inside turned, not because of the sound, but because of the woman who stood silhouetted in the doorway, blocking out the unforgiving sun. Her name was Clara June. She was tall, sun-bitten, maybe 19 years old, and looked like she was done waiting on fate to do her any favors. She stepped inside with nothing but a flour sack in one hand and a simmering fire in the other. Her boots were worn, her skirt was patched, and there was a story of red dirt and hard miles etched into the lines around her eyes. The saloon wasn't hiring cooks, wasn't hiring anyone, to tell you the truth. Times were hard, and the air inside was thick with the smell of cheap whiskey and quiet desperation. But that didn't stop her. She stomped straight up to the bar where he stood, arms crossed, eyes like a pair of dried-up thunderclouds. Cole Merritt. The man hadn't smiled since the war ended, and folks whispered that even then, it had been more of a grimace than a grin. He ran the saloon the way he lived his life, quiet, stern, and with one hand always resting near the hammer of a pistol that hadn't seen daylight in years, but had never, ever gathered dust. He was a man made of secrets and sharp edges. Clara didn't wait for him to speak. Her voice cut through the smoke and the silence like a freshly sharpened knife. "I ain't my mother," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "But I can cook just as good, maybe better." The saloon chuckled, a low and mean sound from the dark corners. A few drunks jeered. One man whispered to his neighbor, "She don't know what she's walking into." But Clara didn't flinch, and neither did Cole. She held his gaze. "You give me one chance, Mr. Merritt. One meal. You don't like it, I walk. You never have to see my face again." Cole studied her, from her worn-down boots to the defiant tilt of her chin. He saw the fight in her, the same kind of desperate grit he saw in his own reflection in the dirty mirror behind the bar. He saw something else, too. Something familiar. Something that made a muscle in his jaw twitch. Without a word, he reached under the bar, pulled out a sack of beans, and tossed it onto the counter. It landed with a heavy thud that silenced the room. "Stove's out back," he grunted. Clara didn't thank him. She just nodded once, a quick, sharp gesture of understanding. She grabbed the beans and disappeared into the kitchen, a room no one had used for anything but storage in years. It should have ended right there. One meal, one quick rejection, one more drifter heading down a dusty road. But it didn't, because what happened in that kitchen wasn't just cooking. It was a miracle, or maybe a curse. The stove was half broke, the wood was damp, and the lard had long gone rancid. The place was a tomb of forgotten meals. But Clara worked like a woman possessed. She moved with a purpose that was almost frightening, her hands sure and steady, her eyes focused. And by sundown, a scent began to drift through the saloon. It started faint, just a whisper of onion and pepper. Then it grew, thick as a spell, wrapping around the rough-hewn tables and the hardened men. The smell of cornbread, golden and warm. The smell of peppered beans, rich and smoky. It was the smell of a home most of these men had long forgotten. The laughing stopped. The jeering died in their throats. One by one, the drunks, the miners, the lonely ranchers, they all quieted down. They just sat there, breathing it in, their faces turned toward the kitchen door like flowers seeking the sun. Clara emerged from the kitchen carrying a single steaming plate. She didn't look at anyone. She walked straight to the bar and set it down in front of Cole. He picked up a fork, his face an unreadable mask. The entire saloon held its breath. He took the first bite, chewed slowly, deliberately. He stared at her through the rising steam, his eyes dark and searching. For a long, tense moment, the only sound was the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Then he set the plate down. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a word of praise. He just looked at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. "Come back tomorrow," was all he said. And right then, Clara knew she hadn't just earned a job. She had lit a fuse. She just didn't know how short it was. She did come back. The second day, she brought her own cast-iron skillet, a heavy seasoned thing that looked like it had seen its own share of battles. The third day, she brought a small pouch of her own herbs, tied with twine. By the end of the week, the Lone Trail Saloon wasn't just a place to drink anymore. It was a place to eat. Men started coming from miles around, not for the whiskey, but for Clara's stew, not for the cards, but for her peach cobbler. She didn't smile much. She didn't speak unless spoken to. But the food did all the talking for her. It spoke of resilience, of comfort, of a stubborn refusal to be broken. Cole never asked where she came from. He never asked about the faint, silvery scars that sometimes peeked out from under her sleeves, or why she flinched whenever a door slammed too loud. He saw the ghosts in her eyes, but never asked their names. And Clara never asked him why he slept in the tiny saloon office with a shotgun propped under his cot. She never asked why his right hand would sometimes tremble when the saloon got too quiet, a tremor he would quickly hide by clenching it into a fist. They were two broken people who had found a way to stand back to back, guarding each other's silence. They worked, they breathed, they survived. It was a fragile peace, built on unspoken rules and shared shadows. But peace in a place like this doesn't last long. It's like a wildflower in a rock slide. Pretty for a moment, but doomed. On the 8th day, trouble rode in. It came on a sleek black mare with a silver inlaid bit, and it had 3 shadows trailing behind it. The man in the saddle wore a velvet coat that was too fine for the dust of this town, and he had a smile that was all charm on the surface and all venom underneath. His name was Ellis Rook. The moment Clara saw him through the saloon window, she went pale. Not just pale, she went cold. The ladle in her hand stilled. Her eyes locked on him, and something inside her went quiet the way a field does right before a wildfire rips through it. Every bit of fire she had brought into this town was suddenly smothered by a wave of pure ice. Cole noticed. He always noticed everything. He moved to her side, his voice a low rumble. "You know him?" Clara couldn't seem to find her voice. She just nodded once, a jerky, terrified motion. He knew my mother." Cole waited. He knew there was more, a whole world of pain behind those 3 words. But that was all she would give. Ellis Rook swaggered into the saloon like he owned the floorboards, his spurs jingling a predatory rhythm. He tipped his fine hat, his eyes scanning the room with casual disdain, until they landed on Clara, visible through the pass-through window behind the bar. And then he smiled. It was a slow, cruel, possessive smile that made the air in the room turn sour. "Well, I'll be," he drawled, his voice slithering through the silence. "Didn't expect to see a little Miller girl this far from the holler." The entire room tensed. Cole didn't move an inch, but he looked like a statue carved from granite and fury. It was Clara who moved. She forced her feet to carry her out from the kitchen, her apron still tied tight, the heavy ladle still clutched in her hand like it might save her. Her voice came out steady, a miracle of sheer will, though her eyes were burning. "You want food? You pay, just like the rest of them." Ellis laughed, a sound that held no humor. "Oh, honey," he said, taking a step closer. "I ain't come for supper." His 3 men fanned out behind him. One was broad as a barn door, one had a face like a road map of knife fights, and the third was twitchy, his hand hovering over his gun like a nervous hummingbird. All of them were armed. All of them were watching Clara like wolves watching a lamb. Clara stood her ground. "Then get out!" "You forget whose blood you carry?" Ellis asked, his voice dropping into a menacing whisper. "You think a little salt and fire in a pot makes you new? You think you can just run away from what you owe me?" That's when Cole stepped forward. Not fast, not loud, just a single, deliberate step that shifted the gravity in the room. It was enough to make Ellis take half a step back. "She works here," Cole said, his voice flat and cold as a tombstone. "And you're done talking." Ellis's oily smile vanished, replaced by a flash of pure anger. "You threatening me, Merritt?" Cole didn't answer. He just kept looking at him with those thundercloud eyes, and in that moment, Ellis Rook understood that this quiet saloon owner was not a man to be trifled with. He was something else entirely, something dangerous. "Fine," Ellis spat, turning on his heel with a theatrical flourish. "But I'll be back." He paused at the door and looked back at Clara, his eyes filled with a chilling promise. Some debts don't wash out with grease and grit, they get paid in blood. They left, slamming the door behind them, and the entire saloon seemed to exhale at once. The spell was broken. Cole turned to Clara. Her face was ashen, her knuckles white where she gripped the ladle. "Want to talk about it?" he asked, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "No," she whispered. But later that night, after the lamps were dimmed and the last of the dishes were done, she sat on the back steps of the saloon, staring out into the darkness. Cole came out and sat beside her, not speaking, just offering the silent support she had come to rely on. And she spoke anyway. "My mother worked for him," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Cooking mostly, cleaning sometimes, other things when she had to keep us fed. He owned everything, the land, the store, the people. He owned her." Cole didn't interrupt. He just waited, his presence a solid anchor in the swirling chaos of her past. "When she died," Clara continued, her voice cracking, "he said I owed him everything she hadn't paid back. He said I belonged to him now. The debt was mine. So, I ran. I just ran and didn't look back." She finally turned to look at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I don't want to run anymore, Cole." He looked at her, at the raw courage and the deep-seated terror warring in her face. He nodded slowly. "Then don't." It was a simple promise, but it felt like a vow, a line drawn in the sand. They would stand their ground, together. They had no idea that the ground they were standing on was about to be set on fire. The week that followed felt like holding your breath underwater. Ellis didn't show his face, but his presence was a ghost that haunted the town. The food still brought people in, but the laughter was quieter now. The air was thick with a tension you could taste. Every time the saloon doors swung open, every eye darted toward it, expecting to see that velvet coat and that venomous smile. Clara didn't sleep easy. Neither did Cole. He started keeping the shotgun closer, and she started sleeping with a heavy skillet by her bed. Then, on a Thursday morning thick with heat and dust, a package arrived. It was left on the front step of the saloon, wrapped in cheap burlap. There was no note, no name, just an object inside. Cole brought it in and set it on the bar. Clara unwrapped it with trembling hands. Inside was a broken ladle, its wooden handle snapped clean in two, and a burned, tattered scrap of an apron. Her old one, the one she'd left behind when she ran. It wasn't just a threat. It was a message. "I know where you came from. I know what you love. And I can burn it all." Clara didn't say a word. She just stared at the ashes on the fabric, her face hardening into a mask of cold resolve. The fear was still there, but something else was growing alongside it. Anger. Pure, righteous anger. That night she found Cole in the office, cleaning his pistol. "Teach me," she said. He looked up, his movements pausing. "Teach you what?" "How to shoot," she said, her voice steady. "I can't just keep stirring stew while the past is getting ready to set fire to my porch." Cole looked at her for a long moment, seeing the girl she had been and the woman she was being forced to become. "You sure about this, Clara?" "I'm sure," she said. He showed her in the back alley behind the saloon, after the town was asleep. He was patient, methodical, firm. He taught her how to stand, how to breathe, how to hold the heavy revolver so it felt like an extension of her will, the way someone might teach a child to read or a dog to heel. She listened. She learned. Her aim was shaky at first, her grip clumsy. The recoil bruised her wrist, but she didn't flinch. Not once. By the second lesson, she could hit the fence post dead center. By the third, she was shattering the bottles Cole set up. By the fifth, under the pale light of a lantern, she put a bullet clean through the flame of the candle without touching the wick. Cole started calling her June, not Clara, not Miller, not the girl, just June. Like she was somebody new, somebody forged in fire and gunpowder. And for a little while, that felt like it was enough. Then came the real fire. It started small, just a curl of ugly black smoke slithering under the kitchen door late one night. But in seconds, the dry wood of the back wall was lit up like Judgment Day. Clara screamed for water, and Cole came barreling through the saloon with a bucket in each hand. Together they fought it, their lungs filling with smoke, their faces streaked with soot. But the flames were hungry. They ate fast, too fast. They licked up the walls, devoured the curtains. The old stove, the one that had been her salvation, exploded in a shower of sparks. The rafters overhead groaned, threatening to collapse. It was a lost cause. "Get out!" Cole roared, grabbing her arm. She didn't argue. She grabbed the one thing she couldn't replace, the ledger book where she kept her mother's recipes. He grabbed the rifle from behind the bar. They made it out into the street just as the roof caved in, sending a volcano of embers into the night sky. They stood there, with singed hair and scorched boots, and watched their fragile peace burn to the ground. The town gathered, their faces lit by the hellish glow. Everyone knew who was behind it. Ellis Rook's name was a poison whispered on the wind, but he was nowhere to be seen. He was a ghost who left only ashes in his wake. Clara didn't cry. She stood in the ruin, soot on her cheek, the ledger clutched to her chest. Her eyes were fixed on the flames, but she wasn't seeing destruction. She was seeing a declaration of war. She whispered one word, a promise to the fire and to the ghost who started it. "We rebuild." Cole stood beside her, his face grim, and didn't say no. And that night, with the stars blinking cold above them and the saloon still smoking behind them, Clara June looked him dead in the eye. "I'm staying," she said, her voice raw but unbreakable. "If you're with me, we make a stand, right here, right now." He didn't smile. He just nodded once. But in the distance, high up on the ridge overlooking the town, someone watched them. A lone figure on a black horse. The moonlight glinted off the silver on his saddle and the spurs on his boots. He watched the fire die down, a silent witness to the chaos he had unleashed. He was supposed to be a ghost, a shadow. But as he watched Clara and Cole stand defiant in the ashes, he realized something. They weren't broken, they weren't running, and that made him very, very angry. He was just getting started. This town had no idea how much it was about to burn. By morning, the ridge was empty. There were no tracks in the dust, no trace left behind. It was as if the watcher had been a figment of the smoke itself. But Clara didn't need proof. She knew Ellis had been there. She could feel his smug satisfaction in the chill of the dawn air. Her dreams had been full of it, the hiss of flame licking at her heels, the scent of burning pine, and his voice, that oily, cruel voice, calling her by the name she no longer claimed. Miller Girl. She woke before the first rooster crowed, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford. Instead, she crept from her cot in what was left of the saloon's back room. She stepped barefoot across the scorched floorboards, the ash cool and soft under her feet, and began to sweep. She was clearing away the ruin before the sun had even decided to rise. By the time Cole stepped through the charred remains of the swinging doors, his shirt half buttoned, his hair still damp from a bucket wash, Clara had already cleared a large patch of the floor. She had stacked the broken chairs into a sad, splintered pile, and now she was bent over a wash basin, scrubbing the soot from the one skillet that had survived the inferno. "You've been up long?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. She didn't look at him. "Long enough." Cole stood in the silence for a beat, watching her. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the fierce, stubborn set of her jaw. He crossed to the counter, or what was left of it, and set down a sack of flour and a tin of salt. "Got these from Hank at the general store," he said. "He said they're paid for." He paused. "I didn't pay him." Clara looked up, her eyes questioning. "I know," Cole said quietly. "I did." He watched her scrub, her knuckles raw. "You don't have to do everything yourself, June." "Yes, I do," she shot back, wiping a smear of sweat and soot from her brow with the back of her wrist. She looked around at the devastation, at the skeletal remains of their sanctuary. "Because it's mine now, too." That silenced him, not because he disagreed, but because he understood it all too well. For years, his own survival had meant solitude. Don't rely on anyone, don't trust anyone. But Clara had shattered that solitude, not by asking, but by simply refusing to leave. She was carving out her place right in the middle of his ruin, and in doing so, she was forcing him to rebuild, too. But just as they started to plan, they noticed something. A change in the town. The whispers had started, and they weren't whispers of support. They were whispers of fear. The town rallied at first. That's what towns like this do after a fire, after a flood, after a death. It's a muscle memory of community. Folks brought what they could, planks of wood, rusty nails, pots and pans that had seen better days. Widow Bellamy, a stern woman with a surprisingly soft heart, sent over a stack of plates wrapped in old linen. The preacher offered an old hymnal stand to be repurposed as shelving. And the sheriff, an old hound of a man named Epps with more cough than teeth, stood by with his hands on his hips and muttered, "Don't look like an accident to me." Cole didn't comment. He rarely did. But he saw the way Sheriff Epps watched Clara. He saw the way some of the other men looked at her, too. The way men look when they believe a woman has brought trouble down on them, that she wasn't meant to rise twice from the ashes. It made his skin itch. "You planning on arresting Ellis?" Cole asked Epps one morning as they nailed a new beam into place. "Can't arrest a shadow, Cole," the sheriff replied, not meeting his eyes. "And you know better than most, ain't no law without proof. Right now all we got is smoke and bad feelings." The sheriff's words felt like a dismissal, like a closing door. It became clear very quickly. The town would help rebuild the saloon, but they wouldn't help fight the war. This was Clara's war, and by extension, it was Cole's. They were on their own. That night, Cole found Clara behind the burnt-out shell of the saloon. She was practicing her draw, but not with the pistol. She was using a carved piece of driftwood, shaped like a gun. She moved with a desperate, focused grace, her face a mask of concentration. She didn't hear him approach. "You're holding it too tight," he said quietly. She spun around, fast, her breath catching in her throat. But when she saw it was him, her shoulders eased just a fraction. "I know," she said, her voice frustrated. "But when I loosen my grip, it slips." "Because you're trying to force control," he said, stepping closer. "Let it balance instead. Let it be a part of you." He reached out and guided her hand, his rough, calloused fingers covering hers. The touch was brief, professional, but the space between them crackled with something unspoken. They stood there for a moment, his hand over hers on the wooden pistol, the stars blazing coldly overhead. When she tried the motion again, it was smoother. Not perfect, but better. "Ellis won't stop," she said, her eyes fixed on the distant dark horizon. "Not until he takes something from me, something I can't get back." "He already tried," Cole murmured, his voice low, "and he failed." Clara turned to him then, and she really looked at him, searching his face in the dim light. "Why are you helping me, Cole? Really? Why?" He didn't answer right away. He just studied her face, the defiance, the weariness, the raw determination buried beneath all the soot and sunburn. "Because I know what it means to fight a man who's got more money than soul," he said finally. His voice was laced with an old, bitter pain. "And because you remind me of someone I once knew." "Who?" she whispered. My sister. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and cold. Clara blinked. She hadn't known he had a sister. Had? He nodded once, his gaze turning inward, to a place of memory and grief. She died. A long time ago. Starved while I was off playing hero in a war that wasn't worth the bones it buried. And there it was. A piece of his past, offered up like a fragile gift. Clara understood in that moment that his walls weren't built to keep the world out. They were built to keep the pain in. She didn't push for more. She just stepped back, holstered the wooden pistol in her apron and said, "Then let's make sure no one else starves while we've got hands to cook." They rebuilt the kitchen first. It became their fortress. Cole did the framing, his hammer blows echoing with a grim purpose. Clara hung the pans, arranging them like shields on the wall. When the new stove arrived, a gift from the mayor's wife, who claimed she missed Clara's peach cobbler, they both stood in silence for a moment before lighting it together. A shared flame, a new beginning. The first thing she made was cornbread, simple, honest. It felt like a foundation. But their small victory was short-lived. Just as the saloon was starting to look like itself again, a new face appeared in town, and this one brought a warning that would change everything. The saloon reopened in pieces. Just 4 tables, 2 barrels of whiskey, and whatever mismatched chairs Cole could scrounge up. But people came. Word had spread that the fire hadn't claimed Clara's spirit, and that kind of resilience was a currency in a town that had little else. The regulars returned, quiet miners, lonely ranchers, the tired schoolteacher. Even Sheriff Epps showed up one evening, nursing a single beer and leaving a coin on the bar without taking a drink, a silent gesture that could have meant anything. Then one night, as Clara was wiping down the bar, the door creaked open, not with a bang, not loud, but with a deliberate, hesitant slowness. A girl stood in the doorway. She couldn't have been more than 16. She had a dirt-smudged face, was missing one boot, and her eyes were wide with a hunger that went deeper than just food. It was the hunger of the hunted. Before anyone else could react, Clara moved. "Kitchen's open," she said, her voice soft, already heading for the back. She didn't ask questions. She saw the need and met it. That was who she was. Cole followed her without a word, his instincts screaming that this was more than just another drifter. The girl didn't speak until she had a plate of food in her trembling hands. Then, between desperate bites of bread and spoonfuls of stew, she whispered, her voice hoarse. "He's coming." Clara stilled, the cloth in her hand freezing mid-wipe. "Who's coming?" "Ellis," the girl breathed. "He's got men. Lots of them. He's mad 'cause you didn't burn. Said he's going to burn every place you ever touch until there's nothing left but ash." The girl didn't know Clara's name. She only knew her face, from a description Ellis had given his men. She said she'd been told to follow the smoke. She said Ellis's boys had left her for dead in a ditch when she refused to carry their vile message any further. Cole helped the shaken girl to the cot in the back room, the same one Clara had slept on. Clara sat beside her long into the night, listening to her ragged breaths, the weight of the girl's story settling in her own chest like a stone. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about anyone Ellis saw as disposable. The next morning, the town woke to find a warning etched into the new wood of the saloon's door. A long, wicked-looking knife was stuck into the frame, and from it dangled a strip of red cloth, like a flag of conquest. On the cloth, written in what looked like charcoal and hate, were 4 words. "She belongs to the ashes." Cole ripped the knife out of the wood and threw it into the dirt. Clara took the red cloth and burned it in the new stove until it was nothing, but the town had seen it, and this time, the fear took root. By noon, the whispers were no longer whispers. They were accusations. "She brought this trouble on us. We don't need her war here. She's just like her mother, tangled up with a man like that." The preacher stopped coming for his evening coffee. Widow Bellamy, the same woman who had brought plates, sent her son to quietly take them back. Sheriff Epps said nothing, but he started locking his office door at night. Even Hank from the general store, who had always been kind, now offered her salt with a sad shake of his head and averted eyes. The town that had rallied was now retreating, pulling away from her like she was a disease. Clara didn't cry, but she didn't cook that day either. The stove stayed cold. Cole found her on the small hill above town, where the wind tugged at her skirt and the old grave markers leaned like tired men. "They want me gone," she said, without turning to look at him. "And I can't stay where I'm not wanted, Cole. It's not fair to them." He stood beside her, looking out over the town that was trying to cast her out. "You think the wind asks permission to blow?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. She finally looked at him, her eyes pleading. "What if I get you killed? What if I get all of them killed? Then I die with my boots on," he said, his gaze unwavering. Not hiding in a hole, waiting for a monster to pass by. It was the most he'd said in a week, maybe in a year. And in those words, she found a sliver of strength. She smiled then. It was a small, sad, but very real smile. When they returned to the saloon, the girl, they had learned her name was Mina, was waiting for them. She was holding something wrapped in a bloodied cloth. "I took it," Mina whispered, her eyes wide. "From his saddlebag, while he was sleeping it off, before I ran." She unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a silver locket, tarnished with age. Cole's breath hitched. Clara took it, her fingers trembling as she opened it. Inside was a tiny, faded photograph of a younger Clara, standing beside her mother. Her mother was smiling, a genuine, happy smile that Clara had almost forgotten. But it wasn't the picture that made Clara's blood run cold. It was what was tucked behind it. A small, folded piece of yellowed paper, her mother's handwriting. It wasn't a letter. It was a confession. Not her mother's confession. It was a detailed account of a crime she had witnessed. A murder, a man framed, and it was signed and dated. And at the bottom the name of the killer, Ellis Rook. Clara stared at it, her mind reeling. This was it. This was the proof Sheriff Epps said he needed. This was the weapon that could finally end it all. Her mother hadn't just been a victim. She'd been a witness. She had been fighting back in her own quiet way, hiding the truth in the one place she knew Ellis would never look. "Mina," Clara whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea what you've done." But before they could even process this earth-shattering discovery, they realized something terrifying. Ellis hadn't been burning things to terrorize her. He had been searching for something. He had been trying to destroy this locket. And now that he knew Mina had escaped with his saddlebags, he would stop at nothing to get it back. The war hadn't even started yet. The knowledge of what the locket contained changed the air in the saloon. It was no longer just a haven. It was an arsenal. The small, folded paper was more powerful than any gun and more dangerous. "We have to get this to the marshal in Edgewater," Cole said, his voice urgent. "Epps is a good man, but he's outmanned. This is bigger than him." Clara clutched the locket in her hand. "He'll be watching the road to Edgewater. He'll expect us to run to the law." "Then we don't do what he expects," she said, a new cold fire in her eyes. "He thinks I'm a cook who got lucky. He thinks you're just a broken-down saloon owner. Let him think that." A plan began to form, a desperate, dangerous gamble. That night, Clara didn't cook stew. She cooked fury. She took the hottest peppers Hank had in his store, ground them with spices that could make a man's eyes water from 10 paces away, and mixed it into a thick, fiery paste. It was a beautiful, angry red, the color of vengeance. She packed it into a single jar, corked it, and tied it with twine. Cole took the jar and rode out alone under the cover of darkness. He didn't ride toward Edgewater. He rode toward the hills where Ellis and his men were camped. The next morning, Ellis Rook woke to find the jar sitting on the stump outside his tent. There was no label, but it was still faintly steaming in the cool morning air. Thinking it a tribute from some terrified local, or perhaps a foolish peace offering, he opened it. He took one big bite. The scream that followed echoed through the hills. He spat blood and fire, his mouth a furnace of agony. It was then that his men found the small note tied beneath the jar. It was written in Clara's clean, steady hand. "You think you know fire? You haven't seen anything yet." Ellis's laughter, when he could finally breathe again, was not the sound of a scared man. It was the sound of a man thrilled by the fight. He had underestimated the little Miller girl. "Good," he rasped to his men, wiping blood from his chin. "Let her burn hotter. I like a fight with some flavor." He mounted his horse, his eyes no longer on the town, but on the horizon. He knew she had something, the locket. His rage was a cold, sharp thing now. He wasn't just going to burn her town. He was going to dismantle her life piece by piece until she came crawling back to him, begging to give him what was his. And as he rode, his eyes flicked toward the road that led west. Not to New Penance, to somewhere else. He wasn't going to attack her directly. He was going to attack the idea of her. He was going to poison the well. The news came 2 weeks later, carried by a traveling merchant. A story was spreading through the territories. A story about a crazed woman in a town called New Penance, a woman who had burned down her own saloon for the insurance money, a woman who had murdered a man in cold blood and blamed it on an upstanding citizen named Ellis Rook. The lies were so outrageous, so vile, that they had to be his. He wasn't just attacking her with fire anymore. He was attacking her with words, poisoning her name, turning the world against her before the fight even began. Clara felt a cold dread creep into her heart. How do you fight a lie? How do you shoot a rumor? She stood in the middle of her rebuilt saloon, the silver locket feeling heavy in her pocket. The town was behind her now, but the world was turning against her. They were an island in a sea of Ellis Rook's poison. And then the second piece of news arrived, and this was worse. A federal marshal was on his way, not to arrest Ellis, to arrest her. The news hit the town like a physical blow. A federal marshal. It meant Ellis's lies had reached the ears of the law. His money and influence had woven a story so convincing that the very people who were meant to deliver justice were now coming to chain it. "It's a trap," Cole said, pacing the floor of the saloon. "He gets you arrested, gets you out of town. Then he comes for the locket. And without you here, without the town standing together, he'll tear this place apart to find it." Clara stood by the window, watching the dusty street, her face grim. "They won't listen to me. I'll be a prisoner before I can even speak." Fear, cold and sharp, began to seep back into the town. They had faced down thugs and fire, but facing down the legitimate law was a different kind of battle. How could they fight a man in a star-spangled badge? "We can't," Sheriff Epps said, his old face looking defeated for the first time. "If a U.S. Marshal rides in here with a warrant, I have to honor it. It's the law." The town was fracturing again, the fragile unity they had built threatening to shatter. Some people started talking about leaving, packing up their lives before the storm hit. They had stood with Clara against a bully, but they wouldn't stand against the United States government. That night, a deep quiet fell over New Penance. It was the quiet of impending doom. Clara sat in the dark, the locket in her hand, the confession of her mother a burning secret against her palm. She felt like she was back at the beginning, alone against the world. Mina found her sitting there, her small face etched with worry. "What are we going to do?" she whispered. Clara didn't have an answer. For the first time, she was truly lost. She had fought with fire, with food, with bullets, but she didn't know how to fight a lie that wore a badge. Then Cole walked in. He wasn't carrying a rifle. He was carrying an old leather-bound book. He set it on the table in front of Clara. "My father was a lawyer," he said quietly. "Before the war? Before everything?" Clara looked up at him confused. "He taught me a few things," Cole continued, opening the book. "He always said that the law is a weapon, and it can be used for you or against you. Ellis is using it against you. So we have to use it better." He pointed to a passage in the book. "A federal marshal can't act on a warrant outside of his jurisdiction without the cooperation of the local authority. and a warrant can be challenged if there's evidence of malicious prosecution. A tiny spark of hope flickered in Clara's chest. What does that mean? It means, Sheriff Epps said, stepping out of the shadows where he had been listening, that I may be an old, coughing hound dog, but I'm still the law in this town, and that marshal isn't taking anyone anywhere until I'm satisfied. The twist was so unexpected, it took Clara a moment to understand. Epps wasn't defeated. He was getting ready to fight. But you said, Clara started. I said I had to honor the law, girl, Epps grumbled. I didn't say I had to make it easy for a man who's been bought and paid for. We're going to give that marshal a trial right here in this saloon. Our own trial. The plan was insane. It was audacious. It was probably illegal. It was perfect. They had 2 days before the marshal was expected to arrive. They turned the saloon into a courtroom. They built a witness stand out of whiskey crates. They prepared their case. Cole, with his father's law book, would act as Clara's counsel. Sheriff Epps would be the judge, and the entire town would be the jury. Their key piece of evidence was the locket. But they had a problem. The confession was just a piece of paper. Ellis could claim it was a forgery. They needed more. They needed a witness. Mina, Clara said, her heart aching at what she was about to ask. He will try to destroy you on that stand. He will say terrible things. Mina looked at Clara, her young face set with a resolve that mirrored Clara's own. Let him, she said. I'm not that scared little girl in a ditch anymore. I'm not running. But Cole knew it wasn't enough. A jury of their own people would believe them, but the marshal wouldn't. They needed something to shake him, something undeniable. There was another man, Cole said, his voice low and tight. A man who worked for my father. He knew about Ellis. He knew about the murder. He fled after my father was framed. I heard he was hiding out in the Badlands, living under another name. Can you find him? Clara asked. Cole looked at the clock. It's a long shot, a ghost chase, but I have to try. He rode out that night, a man on an impossible mission, leaving Clara, Mina, and the town to prepare for a showdown that would determine all of their fates. The marshal would arrive in less than 48 hours. The stage was set. The players were in place. The entire future of New Penance would come down to a trial held in a saloon, judged by a coughing sheriff, and defended by a broken-down gunfighter. They were betting everything on the truth. They just had to hope the truth would be enough. The marshal arrived right on time, a tall, imposing man with a handlebar mustache and eyes that had seen too much to be impressed by a backwater town. His name was Marshal Thompson, and he rode in with 2 deputies, their hands resting confidently on their pistols. He didn't seem surprised to see the entire town gathered in the street. He looked at the barricade at the end of the road with a flicker of annoyance. Sheriff Epps met him in the middle of the street, leaning on his cane. Marshal, welcome to New Penance. Sheriff, Thompson said, his voice like gravel. I have a warrant for the arrest of one Clara Miller, also known as Clara June, for murder. I'd appreciate your cooperation. Oh, you'll have it, Epps said with a wheezy smile. Just as soon as we deal with a little local matter. See, we have our own evidence to present. We're holding a preliminary hearing. You're welcome to observe. In fact, I insist on it. Marshal Thompson's eyes narrowed. This is highly irregular, Sheriff. These are irregular times, Marshal, Epps replied, gesturing toward the saloon. Court is now in session. The saloon was packed. Every single resident of New Penance was there, their faces grim and determined. They were a wall of silent support. Marshal Thompson and his deputies stood in the back, their expressions a mixture of anger and disbelief. The trial began. The prosecutor was Hank from the general store, who read out Ellis's official complaint in a trembling voice. It was a masterpiece of fiction, painting Clara as a manipulative seductress and a cold-blooded killer. Then Cole stood up. He hadn't returned from his quest. He had failed to find the witness. They were on their own. He looked tired, but his eyes burned with intensity. I call Clara June to the stand, he said. Clara walked to the witness box made of crates, her heart pounding. She told her story, simply, honestly. She spoke of her mother, of Ellis's cruelty, of the fire, of the threats. When she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the house, except for the marshals. "A compelling story," Thompson said from the back of the room, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But it's just that. A story. Hearsay and accusations. I have a sworn affidavit." "We have more than a story," Cole shot back. "We have proof." He held up the locket. He opened it and read the confession aloud. The words of Clara's mother filled the room, a ghostly voice from the past detailing the cold, calculated murder Ellis had committed. The marshal shifted his weight, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, but he recovered quickly. "A piece of paper that could have been written by anyone. It's not enough." "Then we have a witness," Cole said, his voice ringing with conviction. "I call Mina to the stand." Mina walked to the stand, small and terrified, but resolute. She told her story of escaping Ellis, of finding the locket. The marshal's deputy, a sneering man with a cruel mouth, began the cross-examination. He was brutal. He twisted her words, called her a liar, a thief, an accomplice to Clara's crimes. "Isn't it true," the deputy snarled, "that you're in love with Cole Merritt? That you and Clara conspired to frame Mr. Rook so you could have him and his money all to yourselves?" The accusation was so vile, so absurd, that Mina just stared at him, speechless. The crowd gasped. But before she could answer, Mina's eyes flickered to something behind the deputy. A slow, genuine smile spread across her face. "No, sir," she said, her voice suddenly clear and strong. "That's not true. But I think you should ask him yourself." Every head in the saloon turned. Standing in the doorway, covered in dust and grime, was a grizzled old man, and right behind him, looking grim and determined, was Cole. He had found him. "Who in the hell are you?" Marshal Thompson demanded. The old man stepped forward, his eyes locking on the marshal. "My name is Jacob Smith," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "And 20 years ago, my name was Jacob Vance. I was a clerk for a lawyer in Blackstone County, and I watched as my boss, a good and honest man, was framed for a murder he didn't commit. A murder committed by his client's son, a boy named Ellis Rook." A collective gasp went through the saloon. Cole stepped forward, his eyes burning into the marshal's. "That lawyer was my father." The final twist, the one that connected everything. Cole's stoicism, his quiet rage, his immediate kinship with Clara, it all snapped into place. This was never just her fight. It had been his fight all along. He wasn't just saving a stranger. He was avenging his own blood. Jacob continued, his voice growing stronger. "I saw the evidence Ellis planted. I saw the witnesses he paid off. He threatened to kill my family if I spoke up. So I ran. I've been running ever since." He pointed a trembling finger at the locket in Cole's hand. "But before I left, I saw Mrs. Miller write that confession. She was the only other one who knew the truth. She was a brave woman." Marshal Thompson was stunned into silence. His case, built on Ellis's lies, was crumbling around him. The sworn affidavit was worthless. The local law was against him. He had a living witness corroborating a dead one, and he had a town that was ready to go to war to protect its own. He looked at the faces in the crowd. He looked at Clara, at Cole, at the old man who had come back from the dead to speak the truth. He looked at his own deputies, who were now looking at him with doubt. He was a man of the law, but he was also a man who knew when he had been played for a fool. He slowly unpinned the badge from his chest and set it on the bar. "This warrant," he said, his voice heavy with defeat, "appears to have been issued under false pretenses. As of this moment, I am no longer acting in a federal capacity." He looked at Cole. "What happens now is town business." He turned and walked out of the saloon, his deputies trailing behind him like scolded dogs. A roar of triumph erupted in the room. The town had won. They had fought the law with the truth, and the truth had prevailed. But their victory was short-lived. Just as the celebration began, the saloon doors burst open again. A young boy, breathless and terrified, stumbled in. "He's here," the boy screamed. "Ellis, he's at the edge of town. And he's not alone." The celebration died instantly. The blood drained from every face. Ellis knew he had lost his legal battle, so he had come to finish it the only way he knew how, with fire and blood. The real trial was about to begin. They didn't have time to plan. They barely had time to breathe. The joyous chaos of the courtroom victory curdled into the frantic, organized panic of war. "Barricade the doors!" Cole roared, his voice cutting through the fear. "Rifles to the windows! Hank, get the women and children to the root cellar behind your store. Epps, top floor of the hotel. You'll have the best vantage point." Orders were flying and people were moving. The saloon, which had been a courtroom moments before, was now a fortress. Men who had been a jury were now soldiers. Clara grabbed a rifle, her hands steady, her mind unnervingly calm. This was it. The final stand. No more running. No more hiding. She found Mina, pressing a smaller pistol into her hands. "Stay down, stay low, and only shoot if they get through the door. You understand?" Mina nodded, her young face pale but set with grim determination. From the window, Clara could see them. They came at noon, under the high sun, bold and arrogant. Dust rose on the horizon like a curtain parting for the final act of a bloody play. Ellis rode at the center, dressed in his fine black coat, a crimson scarf tied around his throat like a badge of his own evil. At least a dozen men rode with him, a rough-looking crew, their faces hard, their rifles held at the ready. They stopped at the edge of town, a silent, menacing line. This wasn't a raid. This was an invasion. Ellis dismounted slowly, a cruel smile playing on his lips. He looked around at the silent town, at the shuttered windows, and he laughed. "Come on out, little cook," he bellowed, his voice echoing in the deathly quiet street. "Come out and face your judgment. You can't hide behind your sheriff and your broken-down gunfighter forever." The first shot didn't come from the saloon. It came from the hotel roof, a single, clean crack. One of Ellis's men jerked in his saddle and toppled to the ground. Sheriff Epps, the old hound, still had a bite. All hell broke loose. Gunshots erupted from every window, every doorway. The air filled with the scream of ricocheting bullets and the thunder of rifles. Glass shattered, horses panicked and screamed. Clara was at the front window of the saloon, firing with a cool precision she didn't know she possessed. She wasn't aiming to kill, just to disable, to drive them back. A bullet grazed her cheek, drawing a thin line of blood, but she didn't even flinch. Beside her, Cole was a machine of deadly efficiency. He fired, reloaded, fired again, his movements economical and sure. He was no longer just a saloon owner. He was the soldier he had tried to bury, resurrected by necessity. But Ellis's men were professionals. They advanced steadily, using wagons and water troughs for cover. Their fire relentless. Widow Bellamy, who everyone thought was hiding, appeared in the doorway of the bakery with an old, double-barreled shotgun. She dropped 2 riders who were trying to flank the alley, her face a mask of cold fury. Jacob, the old witness, was crouched behind a barrel, firing an ancient pistol with surprising accuracy. The entire town was fighting. This wasn't Clara's war anymore. It was theirs. Ellis wasn't firing. He was walking slowly up the center of the street, a pistol in each hand, seemingly untouched by the chaos around him. He was walking toward the saloon. He was walking toward Cole. "This is where you die, Merritt," Ellis screamed over the din. "All that hope, all that fire. You think you're going to save her?" Cole stepped out from behind the bar and stood in the doorway of the saloon in plain sight. A ridiculously brave, stupidly noble gesture. He raised his rifle. "No," Cole yelled back, his voice clear and strong. "I think she already saved herself." Ellis didn't blink. He just smiled that venomous smile. Then he drew his pistols and fired. The gunfight between them wasn't clean or pretty. It was desperate and brutal. Cole fired, hitting Ellis in the thigh. Ellis staggered but didn't fall, returning fire. His bullet struck Cole in the shoulder, spinning him around. Cole grunted in pain but brought his rifle back up. Clara screamed and fired at Ellis, but her shot went wide. Just as Ellis raised his pistol to finish Cole, a shot rang out from the saloon's kitchen window. Ellis's other arm jerked back, his second pistol clattering to the dust. Mina, the girl, had made her shot. Ellis was wounded, disarmed, his men falling or fleeing around him. The tide had turned. He looked at Cole, then at the saloon, his face a mask of disbelief and pure, undiluted hatred. He turned and ran, not away from the town, but toward the old, abandoned church at the end of the street. Clara didn't hesitate. "Cover me!" she yelled to Cole. She scrambled out the window and sprinted after him, her boots slipping on the blood-slicked boards of the street. She burst through the heavy double doors of the church just in time to see Ellis collapse near the pulpit, coughing, one hand pressed to his bleeding thigh, the other to his arm. He looked up at her as she approached, the rifle leveled at his chest. He laughed, a ragged, bloody sound. "You really think this ends with you?" he rasped. "It ends right now," Clara said, her voice shaking with adrenaline and rage. "You shoot me," he coughed, a sick grin on his face, "and you become me, a killer." "No," she whispered, her finger tightening on the trigger. "I shoot you because I survived you." But she didn't pull the trigger. Not yet. She lowered the rifle just an inch. "You don't get to take anything else from me," she said, her voice low and fierce. "Not my mother's memory, not this town, not me." Ellis leaned his head back against the pulpit, blood soaking his fine coat. "You think they'll thank you? You think he'll stay?" he sneered. "They'll always see my mark on you." "They don't have to," she said, her voice breaking through her pain, strong and clear. "I see me." And then she heard footsteps behind her. Mina was there, holding her pistol, her hands shaking but her eyes steady. "She doesn't have to do it," the girl said quietly. "But I can." Clara looked from the monster on the floor to the brave young girl behind her. She shook her head. "No," she said softly. She turned back to Ellis, a profound and final understanding dawning on her. Killing him would be an ending, but it would be his ending. She deserved her own. "You'll live," she said, his face twisted in confusion. "Mercy?" "No," Clara said, a small cold smile touching her lips for the first time. "Justice." She looked at Mina. "Go get the marshal, the real one." Marshal Thompson found Ellis Crowley bleeding on the floor of the church, surrounded by the town he had tried to destroy. The warrant in his pocket was for Clara, but the man in front of him was the real criminal. He had seen the proof. He had heard the witnesses. He had seen the war. He slapped the irons on Ellis's wrists himself. "Ellis Rook," the marshal said, his voice ringing with the authority he had almost abdicated. "I'm arresting you for the murder of John Merritt 20 years ago, and for about a dozen other things I plan on thinking up on the long ride back to a federal judge who owes me a favor." They dragged him through the street in chains. The town watched, some silent, some cheering, some just weeping with relief. Clara sat on the steps of the bullet-riddled saloon, the rifle resting across her lap. She didn't move for a long time. She just watched the dust settle. Cole found her there, his arm in a sling, his face pale but alive. "Bullets out," he said, wincing as he sat down beside her. "Epps says he'll live." "So will we," she said softly. He looked at her, at the blood on her cheek and the strength in her eyes. "I've been wandering a long time, June," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But this feels like ground I could finally rest on." Clara leaned her head on his good shoulder. They watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose, the smoke from the battle finally clearing. The war was over. They had won. They had fought for their home, and in the process, they had built one. It wasn't perfect, and it was scarred, but it was theirs. And for the first time in a very long time, it was safe. The seasons turned. The scars on the town began to fade, covered over by new paint and new growth. The bullet holes were plugged, the wood replaced, but the memory of the fight remained, not as a wound, but as a badge of honor. New Penance was no longer just a place on a map. It was a story, a legend. Clara's kitchen became the heart of the town. She still cooked, but now her food tasted of more than just survival. It tasted of peace, of community, of victory. Mina, no longer a scared girl, took over the bakery. Her laughter became a common sound on Main Street, as sweet as the pastries she sold. And Cole, he stopped looking over his shoulder. He put away his father's law book and took up a hammer for good. He built a small cabin just west of town, with a porch big enough for 3 people to watch the sunset. One evening, as they sat on that porch, watching the fireflies begin their dance, Mina asked the question that still hung in the air. "Do you think it's really over?" Clara looked at Cole, and then out at the peaceful valley. She thought of her mother, of Ellis, of the long, bloody road that had brought her here. "No," she said finally, a quiet wisdom in her voice. "Evil doesn't ever really die, but it can be beaten, it can be silenced, and we'll be ready if it ever comes back." She smiled, a real, deep smile that reached her eyes. "But I think we're through the worst of it." And that was more than enough. It was everything. If you believe that some fires are worth fighting, and that the best meals are shared with the family you choose, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button. You never know when you'll need a story about standing your ground.